Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang. The Good Faith Podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel, and it's where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. And here at Good Faith, we are in a series at the beginning of this year that we're calling Hitting Reset. And the particular angle on hitting reset in the beginning of the year is we're interested in the reset buttons that are less promoted. You're getting a lot of feed in your social media and newsletters about this diet or this exercise. Those are the common ones, then they're fine. But in this series, we want to look at buttons, reset buttons, that are actually less promoted, but maybe much more important, especially because they are less visible. And perhaps the best example of this kind of reset button that doesn't get promoted, but completely determines our life is resetting our spiritual life with God. How do we even know if we need to hit this kind of reset button? And if so, what does it mean to reset in our relationship with God? And to address those and other questions, I have a wonderful guest, John Mark Comer. John Mark Comer is a leading teacher and writer on this crucial topic of spiritual formation in this particular moment of our culture. He does so through his organization, Practicing the Way. He's the author of several important books on this topic, including The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, and his most recent book, Practicing the Way, which I just recently finished, enjoyed, and am so looking forward to talking with him. So, John Mark, welcome to the Good Faith Podcast.
Very happy to be with you, Curtis. Thank you for having me on.
So let's start with this very notion of needing to hit reset in your spiritual life with God. I think different people can hear that topic differently. There is at least one kind of person, maybe who grew up in the church, was the good Christian, and immediately hears that through the lens of guilt. Like, yes, I should be praying more. I should be reading the Bible more. And I think in my experience, and I think this is probably true in yours, that kind of guilt motivation rarely sustains a true lasting reset, because a should is really different than a genuine I need to, and even more different than I want to. So, John Mark, let's start there. How do people discern? Let's start with the need to. How do people discern whether they fall in the category of, I really need to, but it's not a should, it's a need, a deep, genuine need. What are the signs for this?
Well, I don't think there really is any discernment involved in the need to hit a kind of spiritual reset. In my experience, that's happening multiple times through the hour, if not through the day, certainly not once a year.
Yeah.
I have a beautiful short little story I tell in Practicing the Way from the Finnish Orthodox writer Tito Kalliander, who tells a story about a monk getting asked the question, "What do you do all day in the monastery?" And the monk's reply is, "Fall and get back up, fall and get back up, fall and get back up," again and again and again. And I think in many ways that is the spiritual journey. It is just slowly but surely stumbling your way forward into the grace of God and into formation, into people who both receive the love of God and give the love of God.
Mm.
But of course, as you're, I think, rightly naming, this can be a beautiful concept or an ugly one based on whether you kind of view the spiritual journey through a performance lens or not. And there's like a religious version of the performance lens that is often preached against. And that's fine. The problem is the world that it's preaching against mostly doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
It's Philip Reef had his oversimplification of the 4 stages of man, and he had religious man, or kind of a religious age of humanity,
Yeah.
and then psychological man. And his famous line was, religious man was born to be saved, psychological man is born to be pleased. And
Mm.
so there are fundamentally different orientations and motivations. For an older generation and another time, there was this driving like motivation to escape the fear of hell. But for most millennials or educated people living in the Bay Area where you live, or LA where I live, or most anywhere that you would listen to a podcast,
Yeah.
that's not the driving motivation for life. There's a different type of performance orientation, and it's less is God mad at me? And it's more of the like career-based or social media-based. Do I look good? Do I have the right accolades? Whether that's Did I go to the right school? And am I moving up in my job or entrepreneurial project correctly? Or image conscious social media, cool vibe, whatever. It's all the same thing. And it's almost like a secularized version of a performance mentality. So whether you come with the motivation of religious man or psychological man, old school, hellfire and brimstone, or modern day careerist and social media avatar, if that's your frame for fall and get back up again, that's a horrible,
Yeah.
and short-lived motivation. With all things in Christian spirituality, the motivation must be love. That is the only faith, hope, and love are the only fitting motivation. So there are deeper yearnings in the human heart, not to perform or to look good, but actually to be good, to be the kind of
Mm.
person that deeply experiences love and gives it. And that must be our driving motivation.
I love that. So let's talk about how do we nurture the embers of desire and love
Yes.
that actually fuel a lasting reset. What does that look like for somebody in this modern age, where postmodern age, really, where I think those embers are so easily brushed aside? And so, how do we discern that those embers are actually there, and then sort of fan them more into flame?
I was just in London visiting my eldest son, who's over there on a gap year. So, our oldest son is 19, just graduated from high school, and he's over on a gap year at a friend of mine's church. And so, we went over to visit him. And the preacher that day was this lovely young preacher named Joshua Luke Smith. And he used the best analogy for the goal of the spiritual life because it's the holiday season at the time. It was a week before Christmas, and we had just come off of Thanksgiving here in the US. And he said, like on Christmas Day, you're going to have this huge meal, right? And the same could be true for Thanksgiving or the 4th of July or whatever. You're going to have this huge meal and you're going to overeat, and there's going to be apple pie and pumpkin pie and all the things, right? So, what you do, if you're at least a somewhat mature person, is you basically starve yourself all day long.
Right.
So, I will be really careful on Thanksgiving in particular. I will go for a long run. I will exercise. I will eat no sugar. I will eat little to nothing prior to the meal because I want to arrive at the table hungry. And
Mm.
I realize that if I eat junk food or if I snack or if I make a run down to McDonald's in this hypothetical scenario, I'm going to diminish my
Yeah.
appetite for the feast that's coming. And then he just had this great line. He said, the goal of the spiritual life is to arrive in heaven hungry. And
Mm.
I just think there's something to be said. I think it's a very simple human metaphor for the importance of curating our spiritual appetites.
Yeah.
So Jamie K. Smith, who's a scholar on St. Augustine, has done more in recent decades to popularize the theology of St. Augustine from the 4th century, would talk about how human beings are primarily desire-based creatures. We're
Yeah.
lovers first. Augustine essentially said the problem, contrary to how often we think, is not that we don't love, it's that we either love the wrong things. We love work or money or sex or whatever over God, or we love the right things, but in the wrong order. We love our children, or we love our job, or we love church, but we love these things in a kind of disordered way. And so for St. Augustine, discipleship was a kind of process of curating your desire. And that's the thing that I think modern people struggle to grasp because desire is kind of God in modern culture. And what you want, you must get. And increasingly, if somebody else stands in your way, it's a form of, you know, oppression. And if you stand in your own way, it's a form of repression. And that is just a hopelessly naive kind of view of the human soul, because the reality is we can't turn our desires on and off, but we can bend them in one direction or another. We can feed certain desires and starve other ones based on deeper desires. So I think one of the most important things in Christian discipleship is learning to distinguish our kind of most felt and bodily and primal strong desires from our deepest desires.
Yeah.
So, to use a very just blunt and honest analogy, if a person who is wearing revealing clothing walks in front of me, the strongest desire in me as a heterosexual man is to objectify that person, to take another look and another and another and stare at them and draw some kind of pleasure from their appearance and use their body and their choices for my personal pleasure. But that is actually not the deepest desire of my heart. If you find me in a good moment, in the quiet of my heart, when I am most myself before God and others, I desire to be holy, to be clean of heart, to have eyes that are set on God, to be faithful to my wife, not just bodily, but emotionally as well. That's actually the deepest desire in my heart. And so, in that moment of what Christians call temptation, you have to be able to dip below that kind of bodily, primal, animalistic desire to the deeper desire. And so once you get in touch with your deeper desires, then discipleship to Jesus is not a matter of following a list of rules of do's and don'ts. It's about intentionally, any more than, Thanksgiving is about not eating junk cereal for breakfast.
Right.
It's about intentionally curating your life choices, relationships, environments, even decisions in order to grow your spiritual hunger for the right things and diminish your kind of bodily, primal, automatic response kind of desires.
So I want to talk about one way so that this I think needs to happen for many people. So you use the blunt example of sexual arousal as an example of an appetite that needs to be sort of rightly ordered and actually you need to get underneath that. That's an obvious one, but I actually think that uh, the state that I would characterize myself much of the time and many of my friends is the desire to avoid boredom. Like if you were to think of, you said religious man, psychological man, I would put it as a category for this moment, like bored man, like, or the person that wants, or craving for stimulation man, that there is this desire for constant, some sort of stimulation in us. And I would even put your example of sexuality as just one example of the need for like, I cannot be empty. I cannot actually be non-stimulated. And I'm wondering, is there a way to start from there and get underneath that to get to this deepest desire? Because isn't boredom really masquerading, covering over some actual deep desire, and that we actually need to lean into our experience of boredom. And I'm speaking from my personal experience because I think one of the key pivotal moments for my own deepening of spiritual life was just recognizing that evenings I was just, surfing on the internet I've talked about this before, but to research purchases, not because I actually wanted any of those things. It
Right.
was because the act of researching a purchase was stimulating to me. I didn't need, it's like, we don't need a toaster. I don't need a new, whatever, whatever,
But
new,
you're on
new
Wirecutter reading about what the best toaster would be.
100% because it's stimulating. It was stimulating. It was like when it came around 8 o'clock in the evening, when there was a moment when I was feeling this sort of growing boredom. I just needed to stave off that boredom, and I think that's what people are going to. That's why there's this, sort of complete unquenchable appetite for the next streaming series from Netflix and so forth. Is because we just need something new to stave off that feeling of boredom. And something strikes, like it was for me recognizing that and trying to get underneath what is that boredom all about, that I realized, oh, that's actually, I'm trying to avoid emptiness. And that in that was opened up the avenue for me, like, oh, what's behind that? So
Mm.
can you speak to that? Like, how does boredom and our experience of boredom play into this cultivation of spiritual desire for God?
Hmm. Curtis, I'm thinking right now of the paradigm from the East where many people have long talked about the wheel of suffering, which they would describe as craving and aversion. So,
Mm,
meaning, human beings in our natural state apart from God, we're almost on stuck on this hamster wheel of craving and aversion. Craving meaning we're chasing after the things we want, which could be a new toaster oven, it could be an adulterous affair, it could be whatever, it could be anything.
yeah.
And aversion, we're running away from anything that we don't want, in particular, any feelings of pain.
Mm.
And, boredom. And so you have to think about discipleship and whatever emotional coping mechanisms you have just as a human being through this lens of what am I trying to run to and what am I trying to run away from? And I think, the digital age in particular has made boredom a thing of the past,
Right.
like almost like if you're my kids' age, you're like, boredom,
Yeah.
what's that? You have to read about it in a textbook. You're
Yeah.
like, it's this thing we used to have back in the 90s, like before the iPhone and the
Along
internet,
with
right?
VHS tapes. Yeah.
Exactly. It was back with VHS and Atari. It was this old school thing. And boredom for many people, stimulation is an attempt to overcome or to cover up pain.
Mm.
And that pain could be some deep, like wounding going back to like a traumatic experience, or it could just be the pain of a brain that is so overstimulated
Mm.
and miswired by the digital age that it doesn't know how to be at peace with itself. So Anna
Yeah.
Lemke from Stanford has written brilliantly about this in her book Dopamine Nation. She writes about how Americans, as a general rule, the brain is overstimulated on dopamine, that we've confused happiness with pleasure, or in chemical language, serotonin with dopamine,
Mm.
and the feeling of, living a good life before God with other people has been subsumed by the next hit, whether it's the hit of a web page or an actual drug or whatever. It's all, we think of like drugs as these things that you do, but at a, biological level, every time you check your text message, it is
Yeah.
impacting the chemistry of your brain. It's like a little mini drug hit. It's
Yeah.
not heroin, but it is a hit on your brain
You're
that is
getting rewired. Your neural
your
pathways are getting rewired. Yeah.
exactly, and it's
Yeah.
forming you into the type of person that has to check your I mean, all
Yeah.
the research on slot machines is the most addictive thing there is, and how, the phones were designed with slot machine kind of psychology. Even the very fact that I don't know if my phone has any new text messages on it or not is what keeps me checking,
Yeah.
right? If I knew that every single time, it's why I'm never tempted to check my email, because I know there will always be email there. But I'm constantly tempted to check my phone because I don't know if there'll be a text there or not. And there's some part of my
Yeah.
brain that is that intermittent reward system. It just is so hooked on. And so I think for a lot of us, a really helpful question to ask is, like I said a few moments ago, what do I most deeply want? And Jesus would flat out ask that to people at times. What do you really want? And equally important is, what do I most fear, and what
Mm.
pain am I trying to most deeply avoid? And so again, to circle back to the very on the nose analogy, very few people have affairs who are happily married. It's theoretically possible. There are those examples, but it's very rare.
Yeah.
And you might look at someone, they might be married to a beautiful spouse, a wildly successful spouse, gregarious spouse, and still have an affair if there's a pain there in that marriage
Yeah.
and unhappiness. So I think one of the enemy's primary stratagems against followers of Jesus is to make us unhappy and to make sin
Mm.
look like the solution to the problem of our unhappiness.
Yeah.
Ignatius of Loyola famously defines sin as unwillingness to trust that what God wants for me is only my deepest happiness.
Yeah.
And understood with modern kind of California ears, that could be used and abused. But
Yeah.
he wasn't a modern Californian. He was a 16th century Spaniard. And in his context, that is a deeply beautiful concept.
Yeah. So it seems then that one of the resets we need to hit is just simply the expectation that we aren't going to experience pain or discomfort or lack of immediate gratification. Because if we are going to all of these other sources to sort of stave off those feelings, well, then once we dehook from them, even in some small way, then we're just left with all those feelings. And my experience is it's not like immediately God comes in and fills it and takes away all of the emptiness, boredom, pain, loneliness, and so forth. There's a period of where we're sitting in those. It's a
Yes.
detox period, if you will, that we
Yes,
need to, because God just isn't a
exactly.
drug. He's not so mechanistic that he's going to be like, oh, you're off of that drug. Let now my drug will fill in the spot. So that seems like a important, like a truth in advertising thing in spiritual formation, that we actually have to tell people like, hey, this is this pathway of love and desire fulfillment. There's this period of emptiness there, that of
Yes.
pain, of boredom.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, what has to be said as the precursor to that is that not facing your pain is even more painful, not
Mm,
even long term, but short term. So, that's why they call it the wheel of suffering, because they
yeah.
would say that as long as you're on the hamster wheel, and I think
Yeah.
this can be deeply aligned with Christian theology, as long as you're chasing after what you want and it's not God, and running away from what you don't want and it's all pain, that itself is where suffering comes from, because you're never going to succeed. You are on a
Yeah.
hamster wheel. You're
Yeah.
never going to get away from pain, and you're never going to achieve bliss. And so, the deepest pain comes from trying to stop pain that can't be stopped.
That's right.
So any pain that can be stopped, we should absolutely stop. Just want to clarify. I don't feel well right now. I have a bad head cold. I just took a few aspirin right before this call. Like, I'm not I'm very much for that. If it can be stopped, if a light headache can be stopped with a couple aspirin, go take a couple aspirin. But there are deep pains in our life that cannot be healed,
Yeah.
cannot be fixed. That's the great problem with so much of even the modern Christian preaching. It's a huge problem with a lot of modern therapy. They are trying to fix problems that ultimately cannot be
Yeah.
fixed.
Yeah.
And that ironically causes more pain and suffering. So that has to be the precursor. Like, listen, there's no version of your life where you don't feel pain and suffering. You can distract yourself and distract yourself and distract yourself and numb yourself and numb yourself and numb yourself. And that will just at best delay the problem and make it worse. But yeah, you're absolutely right that there is a detox period. There is a recalibration, even at a neurobiological level for
Mm,
many of us. Like, we are bodies. We're not just these, ethereal souls. And so kind of, when you eat sugar a lot over the holidays and then do a cleanse in January, you're going to feel a little depressed for 3 days. And that's not because God's abandoned you or the promises of the gospel aren't true. It's because you ate too much sugar and you have a body, and your body has miswired itself over the holidays or whatever. And so that's a perfectly normal part, I think, of being a human. But it's exacerbated by a culture in which happiness is the highest value.
mm,
And there are some Christians that really want to draw a hard line between joy and happiness. I think that's mostly a polemic and semantics. I think biblically those words are used interchangeably. And I think happiness is actually really, really important, because low joy people are more prone to sin. Low joy relationships are more prone to dysfunction. Low joy discipleship, people, low joy churches are more prone to falling apart. So I think joy really, really matters. But I think the ultimate telos, the highest value for a follower of Jesus, is not, certainly not pleasure, and it's not even happiness, it's not even feeling good, it's love. And happiness becomes a accidental, periodic byproduct of becoming a person of love. And so as long as our metric is wrong, then our means are going to be wrong. And often as Christians, we're just, we live in a culture, and that culture, it seeps into our pores, and it affects how we see the world. That's the power of culture, not so much the questions it gets you to ask, as much as the questions you never even think to ask because of it. You just assume them. So our culture just assumes that the highest value in life is being happy. And while that is a very high value and important thing, as followers of Jesus, we believe that the most important thing is becoming a person of love. And I'm not
yeah.
setting those up as opposed to each other. I think they rise or fall together. They both grow in tandem. They're both very important. But ultimately, love has to be our metric. And love is a form of suffering,
Mm,
which means you have to be able to patiently lovingly, quietly, joyfully endure suffering if you want to become a person of love. Because
Hmm.
love, as defined by Jesus, is to will the good of another ahead of your own, no matter the cost to yourself. It was painful for Jesus to love us on the cross. It is painful to stay married. It is painful to bear patiently with your children. It is painful to bear patiently with your parents. It is
Yeah.
painful to stay in a friendship long term. All love requires pain. So, as long as we build a life apparatus that is designed around avoiding pain, whether through some major dysfunction like heroin or just through researching toasters, no offense, then we will never mature into people of love like we
Yeah.
desire to be.
Amen to all of that. I'll add one other just comment because this is the topic that I've written about is just that in addition to avoiding pain, we also have this deep desire to avoid anxiety, which is just really another form of pain. It's
Absolutely.
anxiety is just the feelings we feel in anticipation of
It's
some potential loss.
anticipation of pain.
It's
Exactly.
anticipation of pain, anticipation of some loss, and the same dynamics that you articulated apply to anxiety. The more we try to avoid anxiety, the more anxious we actually get. It's the
Exactly.
exact same dynamic. All right, we're talking here with John Mark Comer about hitting spiritual reset, and we've started at a very deep level of that. The reset that needs to happen is at a very deep level of desire. What do we desire in life? Do we desire to be people of love, love of God first and foremost, love of others, love of ourselves? Or are we seeking lesser loves that end up deforming us? We're talking about hitting reset in our life with God. And one of the things that John Mark has talked about is that this process of hitting reset is not a one time decision you do at the beginning of the year. It is something that you are continually making. And which brings up the point that it has to get embodied then in practices because it isn't something that we just do once or isn't just something that we, check off or click the switch. It's something that we are continually resetting, falling, getting back up. So, John Mark, let's talk about some practices then, even in a just a daily way. What does it mean for us on a daily level to reset ourselves, to orient ourselves to be people who are characterized by love, love of God and love of others?
Well, I don't think there's one answer to that question. I think it's a really important question for every single one of us to ask. I think, very broadly speaking, some thinkers following Dallas Willard here and many others would kind of categorize the practices of Jesus or the spiritual disciplines, or in just more down to earth language, the regular repeated habits that you see Jesus and see in the life of Jesus when you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and in the
Yeah.
lives of his most serious followers down through church history, into kind of two kind of very broad buckets. There would be disciplines of what some would call abstinence, meaning things you don't do. Like fasting would be a great example. Fasting is not technically something you do, it's something you don't do. You don't eat food. That's a very clear example. Silence and solitude would be another. You don't really do anything in silence. A lot of people misunderstand it and think it's like a time to go away and read 19 books, and you can do that. But true silence and solitude is about not doing. It's about not doing people, not doing noise, not doing any stimulation or input into your mind outside of just what God is stirring up in your own heart. Then there are disciplines of engagement where you intentionally do something with an aim in mind. Bible study is a discipline of engagement. You are doing something. You open your Bible, you read, you go to a website, you open up a commentary. Listening to a podcast like this is a form, kind of a discipline of engagement, or listening to a sermon, or serving the poor, or whatever it may be. These are disciplines of engagement. And as a general rule, disciplines of engagement are most helpful for people that struggle with apathy, boredom, what the ancients would call apatheia, or asadia, sloth,
Yeah.
a kind of spiritual complacency where you kind of love the world more than you love God. You're more interested in the latest, cheesy Marvel movie than you are in reading scripture. And disciplines of abstinence are especially helpful. And again, this is a both and, not either or, but are especially helpful for people who are burned out or exhausted or prone to overwork. Many of the type of people that I would imagine are your neighbors in Silicon Valley
Yeah.
or my neighbors here in LA. And so, for that's a long way of saying, for the type of person that is likely to listen to a podcast like this, probably a reset would begin with more subtraction than addition.
Mm.
Then I think the great mistake that, people make, in particular around the beginning of the year, is they want to get serious about Jesus. All right, I'm going to add in a bunch of new spiritual disciplines. And that is not a bad impulse. I am adding a new one right now as we begin the year. As we record this, we're in the first week of January, and I'm trying to go for a walk at the end of my workday every
Okay.
single day and lightly pray the examen of consciousness, or the examen, before I make my family dinner. And that's an addition to my life, right?
Yep.
That's a new thing that I want to start doing that I think will be good for me on multiple levels. But most of us need to stop doing a much longer list of things that we need to start doing. Most of us are too chronically exhausted and weary and underslept and distracted and overcommitted and overwhelmed to even have much of a spiritual life at all. Your brain gets to a level of dopamine addiction, your body gets to a level of chronic fatigue, that your spirit just begins to grow numb. And an easy example is like if you ever get the flu, you're probably not having your most meaningful prayer times when you're like
Right. Right.
lying in bed. And that's because your body's not well, your
Yeah.
brain is not well. Like,
Yeah.
you're still a Christian, you're still loved by God, but those are probably not going to be your most, oh, I just felt really close to God on day 3 as I was
Yeah.
back and forth with the toilet. But if you just apply that rubric, the same is true at some level when you're exhausted and distracted and overstimulated. Your body is just having to work so hard to keep you at homeostasis.
Mm.
So I think for many people, I'm giving you a generic answer
Yeah.
to a really good question. It begins with simplifying your life, with subtraction, not addition, with doing less, not with doing more.
Yeah. Well, this was the great insight in your book, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. And I do think, yes, probably for the most people who are listening to this podcast, they live hurried lives. That this is
Yes,
the refrain of the thing. Things are busy, like there's almost a commonly accepted state, almost such that if you aren't busy, you sort of feel apologetic, like there's something wrong with you because it's now
absolutely.
held up as the
It's a
standard.
status sign almost,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. So let's just
What's the Oliver Berkman line about how he's never met a successful person that isn't basically the embodiment of walking anxiety disorder?
Yeah, that's right. That's
I mean, there
exactly
is
right.
some correlation between like high career success and just
Oh, no,
people
I've talked to
driven by
CEOs,
anxiety.
Christian CEOs at Silicon Valley who, like, in a moment of candor, admit that their best salespeople are the most spiritually unhealthy people, and that's the reason for their success as salespeople.
Yeah, it's not a
Uh,
feature, it's a bug. Or
it's
not a
not a
bug,
feature,
it's
it's
a
a
feature.
bug.
Sorry, sorry,
Exactly.
sorry, opposite.
And that's our life, unfortunately, and our society and our culture has sort of designed us that way. It feels so hard to break free from that.
Yeah,
I think of just, people in my life, if I were to tell them, you must ruthlessly eliminate hurry, and they haven't yet read your book, um, it would almost feel like, okay, great, but uh, they wouldn't even know where to start.
right.
How do you start? How do you
Yes.
start to actually eliminate hurry so that you're even just resetting, like you said, your own physical bodily condition such that you can even make room for God and make
Yeah.
room for that deeper desires?
Well, I mean, first off, you're absolutely right. It's hard. So, John Ortberg, who has been a friend and a mentor to me, in the foreword for that book of mine, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, said that slowing your life down in the modern world, and again, he was writing this from the Bay Area, is akin to taking a vow of poverty in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
It's an
right.
extreme life decision.
Yeah.
And I love that kind of analogy and metaphor. But I think I list 4 kind of basic practices that have 2,000 plus years of Christian tradition behind them in the ruthless elimination of hurry, and that's Sabbath, silence and solitude, simplicity, and what I call slowing. So those are
Mm,
4 like very pragmatic, on your calendar or not on your calendar, in your daily routine or not. They all fall under the rubric of SMART goals. They are specific and measurable and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And there are more. Those are just the four that I have found most helpful that are not like quirky me things. They're
Yeah.
like way of Jesus for thousands of years thing. And I'm happy to talk more about any one of those if you want to drill down. But again, those are all examples of healthy disciplines of abstinence, of
Yeah.
Sabbath, is a bit of a mix because it's really a day of worship and celebration, but it is a day where you don't work. Silence and solitude are when you don't do people and noise and outside input. Simplicity is when you don't do extra purchases, extra items of clothing, extra things you don't need in your home. And so slowing is when you don't do extra activities and cram it all in, but you intentionally slow your life down to live at a very different pace. So again, our problem is not just conceptual, it is neurobiological. So our solution can't just be aspirational, it has to
Yeah.
be embodied. And
Yeah.
this is where I think a lot of Christians in the modern world fall off the map. They have this aspirational ideal of,
Yeah.
man, I want to slow my life down, but just what's the habits eat willpower for breakfast line?
Right.
I mean, it's just, it will not stand a chance against the digital apparatus of Silicon Valley and the requirements of your job or being a dad with teenagers or whatever. So if you do not take an intentional posture of resistance, you are going to simply be subsumed by the river of our culture.
Well, of the practice, I mean, they're all, I think, in my own experience and the experience of centuries of saints, very powerful practices. Out of all of them, when you list, silence and so forth, um, the one that jumped out to me was when you said Sabbath, because that, of course, is the one that has been most institutionalized. It's the most, in some ways, that has a clear
Yes.
boundaries. It is refraining from labor, but yet it is a practice that is very difficult for the modern American to practice. Can you Let's start by outlining what are the basic kind of minimum requirements for what Sabbath is? Like, what has to be true about a Sabbath practice to actually carry the spiritual functions that it's designed to carry?
Following Marva Dawn, who wrote beautifully about Sabbath, this is my adaptation, not a direct pull from her. But I think that biblically there are about four kind of movements to the Sabbath,
Okay.
and they are stop, rest, delight, and worship. So
Mm,
stop, the word Shabbat, the Hebrew word for Sabbath, most literally means stop or cease. And so it's like you're stopping, you're ceasing from labor. And again, there's centuries and millennia now of healthy thought about the Sabbath. And Heschel and others would say you don't just stop your labor, you stop even thinking about labor. You stop not just worrying, but even wanting. That's why there are prohibitions against buying and selling on the Sabbath. But it's a day to stop working, stop buying, stop. Heschel would beautifully write about how it's 6 days of the earth, we wrestle with the earth. 6 days of the week, we wrestle with the earth, trying to wring profit from our hands.
mm,
But the seventh, we celebrate what is. We just make peace with
mm,
what is. And so lots of people have little idiosyncrasies of they won't buy, they won't sell, maybe they won't make their bed, they won't wash their dishes. They're just little ways to ritualize this
mm,
theology that yes, the world is raw material that as human beings we have to reshape,
mm.
and it's good and life is a gift and we have to enjoy
I
it.
love that. I mean, because I think there's a temptation to use Sabbath as just, oh, that's when I'll get my household chores done and
No,
rest.
and
Yeah,
that's why, yeah, exactly. For
yeah,
modern Christians that were not raised on the Sabbath like
yeah,
me, we have a category for a day off, which
yeah.
is a day where you play, spend money, and do the work you don't get paid for.
Right,
That's not a
right.
Sabbath.
Yeah,
Those are
that's
all
not
great
Sabbath.
things. Play,
Yeah.
there's a place to spend money, and we all have work we need to do that we don't get paid for. That's not a Sabbath, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
you stop all work, not just stop your job.
yeah,
And that's a really, really important distinction. You're stopping labor, and that may be labor you get paid for, it may not.
yeah,
And again, it's not a legalistic rule. We have kids, and does that mean we
yeah,
don't change diapers? No. So stop, rest, which is whole person rest, it's sleep, it's emotional rest, it's even spiritual rest at some level. So there's long-standing tradition of no intercessory prayer on the Sabbath day. because
Mm.
intercessory prayer is a form of work. It's
Yeah.
co-laboring with God,
Yeah.
like a mother in childbirth to bring a new world to birth. And the
Yeah.
Sabbath is a day to rest. Delight,
Wait,
it's
wait, hold on, John Mark. Before you go on, I want to make a comment about rest because I think this is really important that actually we modern people actually don't often actually know what is restful. Because if you actually really discern, for instance, okay, you have some time off. Again, the immediate moment move is to get entertained. And yet, actually, if you sort of do a self examination, like, are you actually more restful after
rested.
watching?
Yeah, yeah, till
Yeah,
2 in
you're
the
not
morning
after
watching
watching a movie,
whatever.
right? Or
No.
you're entertained, but you're not rested. So,
Oh, my Peloton instructor yesterday had this throwaway. I learned so much about secular culture from Peloton. It is like a master's level in cultural analysis. But he said, I've learned there's a difference between vacations and trips, and
yeah.
I've decided I hate vacations. And I was like, oh, that's not a good sign right there. Something
Yeah.
has gone wrong, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
But he's right. There is a difference between, pleasure and rest is
Yeah.
another
Yeah.
way of
That's right.
framing that. Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead with the rest of you. Delight in worship.
Yeah. Delight. Sabbath this is where, when legalists get a hold of anything, they ruin it. And unfortunately, for the very few Christians I knew that grew up schooled in the Sabbath, it was often in kind of a legalistic application of it. And the Sabbath was, well, that's the day you can't watch TV. That's the day you can't play
Yeah.
cards or wear jeans or run or smile,
Yeah.
in its worst iterations. And that is just not the spirit of the Sabbath biblically. It's not the spirit of the Sabbath in the best moments of church history and the Hebrew tradition before and after. Sabbath is a day for celebration. It is a day of delight. It's the seventh day. It's joy. It's feasting. It's communal. So obviously, people think about the Sabbath now run through the lens of radical individualism, and then it becomes like an emotional wellness day, like almost like a private spa kind of day.
Yeah.
But Sabbath is designed to be a communal practice. It's actually an
Yeah.
act of social justice biblically, where all get this day of rest, including your servants and even the animals. Environmental care. It's fascinating. And then the last category would be worship. This is not just a day to chill and wear your PJs and have a good time and count your blessings. It is ultimately a day that is set apart. It's a holy day in the language of
Yeah.
scripture. And holy is less of a moral word and more of a relational word biblically. The word quite literally means separate from or dedicated
Yeah.
to. It's why you can have like holy pots and pans in the Torah. You're reading about, and that doesn't mean they were like more moral than the other
Right.
pots and
Yeah.
pans. It means they were only used for the temple. They were dedicated to the temple. So a holy day is a day that is dedicated to life with God. And I even find that there's a kind of a natural psychosomatic movement through. These are
Mm.
not like, it's not a linear 4-step formula of stop, rest, delight, worship. But I experience the Sabbath that way. First, it just feels like stopping, almost like crashing and my nervous system coming down. Then I rest, I sleep for a long time. I'm normally just really tired at first. And then about halfway through, depending on how exhausting my week was, I just find joy coming back to my heart.
Mm.
I find myself just more and more happy and going on walks and looking at the trees and celebrating the birds, and then that naturally turns into gratitude, into worship, into praise, into, I mean, this last Sabbath, we kind of go sundown to sundown for our Sabbath, and the sundown at the end of the Sabbath was just this rock and roll knockout Southern California sunset. I mean, we live up in the
Oh.
mountains, and it was one of the best sunsets I've seen in a long time. And I just kept walking out on our deck, throwing my hands up and just loving God from my heart. And it wasn't a discipline. It wasn't because I'm so godly or virtuous. It was just this natural, internal,
Mm.
intuitive response to the goodness of my life before God that was cultivated over 24 hours. So I find this kind of natural progression of stopping leads to resting, which enables me to delight, which naturally kind of produces a heart of worship.
That's beautiful. And I just want to affirm this call to Sabbath. I think any of my listeners, if you are not practicing Sabbath in the way that John Mark has been talking about, not you just have a day off, but true Sabbath characterized by stop, rest, delight, worship, it's a great place to start. It's a
That's an
great,
amazing.
obvious reset to hit in the new year if this is not something that currently characterizes your life.
And Curtis, at the risk of just again giving advice that I'm not being asked for, I don't know if you would agree with this or not, but I would just also really encourage listeners, if at all possible, do this with other people. I don't mean like the whole 24 hours. I'm off the charts introvert. I love my time alone and my reading. But Sabbath is a communal discipline. That's one of the
Mm,
reasons there was not a lot specifically said about it in throughout church history, because very quickly it became institutionalized by the
mm,
government by like the 4th or 5th century.
mm.
And so you didn't like have to talk about Sabbath. Like my dad grew up in Santa Clara, not far from where you're at now.
Oh, yeah.
And he tells stories about growing up. This would have been the 1950s and 60s, and how on Sunday everything was closed. Almost everybody went to church. You either went to the Jewish synagogue, you went to the Protestant, the Catholic, or if you weren't a Christian, you went to the mainline church. And almost everybody went to church. Almost everybody had family dinner afterwards, and nothing was open. And he would tell me this story about when 7-Eleven first opened and how revolutionary it was to go buy something on Sunday. And I looked it up. It opened in the Bay Area in 1969. That is not that long ago.
That's amazing.
So if you
Yeah,
were
because
living,
newsflash, John Mark, that's not the Santa Clara that I live in
that is
nearby right now.
not the Santa Clara of today. That's what I'm saying. Like, this is like now the epitome of like the place that
Yeah.
is in so many ways the opposite of that.
Wow.
That
Amazing.
is not that long ago. And
Yeah.
so, in that kind of a communal, even socio-political structure, Sabbath is built in.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, you have to resist. I mean, just kids' sports and social obligations and getting ahead on work email on Sunday nights. I mean, you have to really intentionally
Yeah.
form a kind of outpost against this.
That's right.
And that is just, we are not designed to do that by ourselves. We are designed to form communities that resist the wider culture and bless the wider culture.
Yeah.
And so this is where I think if it's as simple as getting another couple to do a Sabbath
Mm.
meal with you and saying, hey, let's all put our phones in a box for a bit,
Yeah.
just start where you can, but try to do this together.
So, John Mark, I want to talk about we've talked about that. You can imagine how if you're going to take a Sabbath, that's got to be a family decision. If you are part of a
Right.
family, especially with young
Yes.
kids, like who's going to take care of the kids? How is that going to work? How are meals going to be done? Like that's a family decision that the whole family has to embrace if Sabbath is going to take place. I love your idea about looking for other couples to do things with that, so that you can collectively be an outpost of non-hurriedness. I don't know how that will work with kids' sports leagues on weekends or something, but that's another topic for another day. But I want to talk about churches because you've been a pastor for nearly 2 decades. You were the founding pastor of Bridgetown Church in Portland, Oregon. Um, and we have a lot of pastors who listen to this podcast. Talk to them, John Mark. How can they help shepherd their congregations towards this kind of life with God that we're talking about?
Curtis, I think we're living at a really important moment in the history of the church in
Mm,
America.
hmm.
And I think it's really important that pastors change some of how church life is designed,
Yeah.
because some of how it's designed is designed for a world that no longer exists, that is mostly Christian, not mostly secular, where the primary problem is apathy, not anxiety. And I think we're solving for a new set of problems, not
Yeah.
just with the digital age, but with a number of other factors. And Henry Nouwen was writing about this several decades ago. My favorite Nouwen book is Way of the Heart, which is kind of about the Desert Fathers and Mothers and practices like silence and solitude. But it's easy to not realize that that book was actually written to pastors and priests. And
Mm,
my favorite paragraph in the book is this, where talking to his fellow priests or pastors, he says, our task is the opposite of distraction.
mm,
Our task is to help people concentrate on the real but often hidden event of God's active presence in their lives. Hence, the question that must guide all organizing activity in a parish or a local church is not how to keep people busy, but how to keep them from being so busy that they can no longer hear the voice of God who speaks in the silence.
Hmm.
So, American evangelicalism, for anybody that kind of is tangentially in that stream of the church, came out of the first and second great awakenings. And so it has a revivalist spirit to it. And if you go back and study the Great Awakenings, for example, 95% of the people that were born again had already been baptized. So these are not secular, neo-pagans experiencing God for the first time. These are cultural Christians who already would have read the Bible, believed the Bible, at least in their mind, who were not living into it and were not warmed in their heart by it. So in that kind of a cultural context, which is hard for me to imagine, I can read about it in the books, but growing up in the Bay Area and then living in Portland for 20 years and now LA, I've never experienced cultural Christianity ever. And other than like in the pocket of a local church. And so, in that kind of a cultural context, you're constantly trying to stir people up,
Yeah.
activate people.
Yeah.
You're trying to like call up spiritual passion and fight
Yeah.
off apathy and so on and so forth. But that is not the world that I live in.
Yeah.
I live in a world where most people think I'm nuts for believing what I believe.
Yeah.
Most people are frankly too busy and distracted and rich and career minded to even really think much about thinking that I'm nuts for what I believe. They're not really
Yeah.
even, it's not so much that like they don't believe in the spiritual life, it's that they're just too busy to even, most Christians are too busy to have much of a spiritual life.
Yeah.
So I really dream of a new emerging church culture where pastors, like Now and Said, see one of their primary jobs as actually helping people slow down, calm down, quiet themselves to God's real presence deep within.
Hmm.
In the same way that there were several decades where church experience was very married to rock and roll, which is
Yeah.
not historically remotely the norm,
Yeah.
but there are several decades where God really used that. I think in the coming decades, what God will really use is silence and lectio divina and slow meditation.
Yeah.
And I think discovering our times together as the people of God, what I would love is for church to almost teach us how to pray in the
Yeah.
sense of like almost like a guided meditation. Like I was chatting to a church planner recently. I was in a global city, I won't name it. And he said the number one question he got before he church planted was, is it okay for me as a Christian to meditate? And so we had to think about that. And obviously, that word means different things to different people. And there's all different types of meditation, from Psalm 1, Hebrew Jesus kind of meditation, to, you know, psychedelic kind of meditations.
Right.
And so he started his church with a shorter sermon that then ends every single Sunday with a 10-minute guided meditation. They started doing meditation pop ups at Google and other workplaces.
Yeah.
And it's just been this beautiful, and I think he's rightly intuiting we're in a different moment.
Yeah.
And this is a fully Orthodox, he's not some liberal, or this is a fully Orthodox church planner. But he's understanding, man, the theology doesn't need to change, but our application of theologies like the peace of Christ and the coming of the Holy
Yeah.
Spirit and the communion of the saints, it has to change for a world that is distracted, that is addicted, that can barely pay attention, that is chronically exhausted, that is alienated from each
Yeah.
other. So, at a very pragmatic level, I just think that means incorporating things like silence and the reading of scripture into your Sunday gatherings, making them literally quieter. At a community wide level, I think it means looking at forming rules of life for local churches. All local churches have kind of, they don't call it a rule of life in the Protestant tradition, but they have a kind of basic schedule that you follow. You kind of come to church on Sunday, you're in a small group on Tuesday, you
Yeah.
give once a month. I just think that needs to be updated, not just to run a local church, but to arrange a modern life
Yeah.
around God. And that
Yeah.
could be like, hey, we Sabbath together every weekend. and we share a meal on Wednesday nights, and we begin each morning by praying the Psalms. It can be really, really simple stuff.
Yeah.
But I think if church was a place that if you really seriously were involved, it would slow your life down rather than speed your life up. That for me would be one of the goals of success for a modern pastor.
That is going to be so challenging, I think, for any pastor in the current church modern culture. Speaking also as a former pastor, we are just so wired to think programming versus
Yes.
formation.
Well, because you can
And
control programming.
you control programming. The business model of a church actually almost demands programming to sustain its current model. I mean, this is a whole longer conversation. And also, we've been so conditioned to think. And David French and I use this phrase, and I hope it's not too derogatory to the pastors out there. Again, I'm a former pastor, I get it, but like, look, our basic model of spiritual formation in the church is it's a TED talk followed by a Coldplay concert. Like
Right.
that's actually what most Sunday mornings look like, and it's just not working as spiritual formation precisely for the reasons you described. That it's actually filling us up with more distraction, more information, more stimuli versus the emptying that we actually what we're deep down craving for. And so we have to just turn it completely upside down
And
and
this
be willing
doesn't
to
have to be
experiment.
I could not agree more. And this doesn't have to be a criticism of pastors,
Yeah,
because that criticism could just as easily go both ways, that pastors are giving the people what they want,
that's
you know?
right. Yeah,
I mean, we can talk all we want about how church should be to this and church should be that. The vast majority of Christians I knew, if we actually started from scratch and built church how I think it should be built, would want nothing to
nothing
do
to
with
do
it.
with it. That's
It
right.
would be
Yeah,
a ton of time. It would be a ton of work. It would be more money, not less. The money would just go to very different places, you know? And like that sounds awesome when you put all the responsibility on the pastor. But
yeah.
for us to actually live the way
It's a great
serious
point.
Christians in community have lived at the best moments of church history, it's
Yeah,
way too high bar of an entry. So, we critique narcissism in pastors and ambition and ego, but okay, we need to just as quickly, if not more quickly, critique consumerism in us,
right.
lack of
Because
commitment.
that's what's incentivizing the narcissist to,
And
to rise to the ranks. Yeah, yeah,
exactly. And it's
yeah,
so in culture. You see this, it's in the therapeutic culture, even worse than the church. There is an over reliance on insight, of
yeah.
which, and this is not a criticism of podcasts. I love podcasts. I make podcasts. I'm doing one right now with you. I write books. But the modern world so deeply wants to believe that knowing something
Yeah,
equals changing something. So
that's right.
therapy, you have this amazing moment when you connect your present emotional pain or dysfunction to like some experience in your childhood. And it's like this aha moment, and you walk out and you feel transformed. You're not transformed. You're the
Yeah,
same person. Now you're
yeah,
more aware, you
yeah,
have information now, but the actual path to healing and change is almost always 1,000 unglamorous, difficult, small decisions in relationship
yeah,
over a
yeah,
long period of time, which is why getting the insight about why you're messed up takes often a couple hours of therapy, and then actually healing and growing as a person often takes decades. And so there is this addiction to insight that you see in everything from the TED Talk version of church to the Woody Allen weekly therapy session
yeah,
that doesn't have the power. It's powerful, but it doesn't have the power that we think it does.
yeah.
And we want to believe that illusion because we don't want to have to do anything. And if you're a Christian, you can even spiritualize you're not doing anything through kind of Reformation language around
Yeah.
grace and not works. And it's not about works-based righteousness. You can put this weird theological
Yeah.
spin on the realities. You just don't want to face your pain and let Jesus heal you there, you know?
Well, listeners, I want to just commend to you the work and the writing, the resources that have been produced by John Mark Comer. His books you can check out on the website, Practicing the Way. We'll put links in the show notes. I know we have a lot of listeners who come to Good Faith because they want us, and I'm glad to provide help in making sense of the issues in the world, whether it's political polarization, anxiety, institutions. I just want to underline that it is my deep, deep belief, while it's important to make sense of all those issues, the deep underlying crisis is a crisis of spiritual formation. It's we are not forming our people, and that's what's actually producing all of these sub crises, if you will, in the world, which are important to understand and address. But we're going to be playing whack a mole until we actually get to the heart of the reality. Is we need to be forming our people because our people are already being formed by an age that is, well, truly deforming them. And so we're grateful, John Mark, that you are helping us make that transition in this critical moment. Thank you for your work.
Oh, it's my honor. And I hope it's at least a little bit helpful.
And listeners, we invite you to join us next week as we consider other ways that we can hit reset as we gather around the campfire.